At her wedding, the mother-in-law shouted in front of everyone, "She's pregnant, and my son isn't the father." What happened next was devastating. 120 guests standing, another 80 seated in immaculate white chairs, white and red flowers hanging from wrought iron arches, and a soft melody of violins filling the air. The sweet scent of roses mingled with the discreet incense burning in the side aisles of the Church of St. Michael, the Archangel, in the heart of Guadalajara. Everything was perfect. Every detail of Lucia Ramirez's big day had been carefully planned for over a year. She had dreamed of this moment since she was a little girl, walking down the aisle in a white lace dress, a delicate veil falling like mist over her shoulders, her eyes fixed on Diego Herrera, the man she believed would be the love of her life. Lucia felt nervous but happy. Her heart was beating fast as she clutched the bouquet of lilies and looked down the aisle. Diego was waiting for her with a cautious smile, surrounded by friends, family, and photographers. He looked impeccable in a tailored black suit, his face serene, or so it seemed. Next to him, Beatriz, Diego's mother, sat in the front row, looking at her with a faint smile on her lips, as if she knew something no one else knew. Lucia didn't notice. At that moment, she was only thinking about the step she was about to take, leaving her old life behind to start a new one with the man who had won her heart. Lucia's footsteps echoed on the light marble, accompanied by the sighs of the excited guests, the flashes of the cameras, and the admiring glances. She was beautiful, her dark hair pulled back into an elegant bun. Her honey-colored eyes sparkled in the warm evening light filtering through the stained glass windows. The ceremony began. The priest solemnly recited the vows. They were close, and the tension in the air was almost palpable. It was then, at the exact moment when the priest asked if anyone had anything to say, to speak now or forever hold their peace, that everything fell apart. Beatrice stood up suddenly, her navy blue dress wrinkled from the tension, her heels echoing like hammer blows on the marble floor. Everyone turned to her in confusion. Diego frowned. Lucia let out a nervous giggle, thinking it was some kind of joke, but it wasn't. "I will not allow this farce," Beatrice shouted in a sharp voice. "Like a sharp knife, this woman does not deserve my son. She is expecting a child that is not his. She is a slut." A deathly silence fell over the church. All that could be heard was Lucia's rapid heartbeat, the distant sound of a glass breaking as it fell to the floor, and the growing murmur of the incredulous guests. Lucia felt her legs give way, her face contorted into a mixture of disbelief, rage, and fear. "What are you saying?" whispered Diego, barely audible. He looked at her, paralyzed. Beatrice walked toward them, taking a white envelope out of her purse. "Here is the proof that she was with another man 2 months ago. I have witnesses, and everyone will know today. My son is not going to raise someone else's child." Lucia tried to speak, her voice trembling. The lump in her throat was like a claw. "That's not true. I didn't." Diego said nothing. He just looked at her with eyes full of anger and disappointment. "It's true?" he asked, his voice firm, his teeth clenched. No stammering. "Lucia is a liar. I love you." "Diego, you're lying." Beatrice raised her voice again. "You're a liar. A gold digger. You only wanted his money and his last name." Lucia felt everything spinning around her. The stares, the whispers, the cell phones recording. Her father stood up, but didn't make it. Diego, his face contorted, took the ring off his finger, threw it on the floor, and said loudly, "This is over. I never want to see you again." He left Lucia there alone in the middle of the altar. As everyone remained silent, the humiliation was complete. Lucia fell to her knees. The bouquet slipped from her hands. Her tears wet her veil, and an inhuman cold ran through her body. The sound of Diego's footsteps walking away echoed like a painful echo in her mind. Beatrice stood watching her with a satisfied smile through her tears. Lucia instinctively brought her hands to her belly, flat, but where a life was growing. A thought crossed her mind, like a bolt of lightning. What if it were true? What if she were pregnant? Hours later, at home, devastated, her makeup smudged from crying, she opened a drawer with trembling hands and took out a pregnancy test. She looked at it with dread, as if fate were about to deliver its final sentence. She went into the bathroom, closed the door, and after what seemed like an eternity, the result appeared. 2 lines. Pregnant. Her breath caught in her throat. Public humiliation was already her hell, but reality was just beginning. Raindrops pounded insistently on the windows of Lucia's small apartment, as if the sky itself wanted to make her feel that she had nowhere to escape. The day was over, but the storm continued. The normally noisy city of Guadalajara seemed to have fallen silent, as if sharing she still felt the humiliation burning her skin. The apartment, once decorated with hopes and dreams and furniture bought on credit to start her life with Diego, was now an empty echo of failure. Lucia sat on the living room floor, still wearing her crumpled, dirty wedding dress, stained with tears and shame. The torn tulle revealed her trembling shoulders. She didn't have the strength to change, nor was there no one to help her up. The dim light from an old lamp barely illuminated her pale, swollen face. From crying so much, her red eyes were fixed on the pregnancy test she still held between her fingers. 2 clear, inevitable lines. The air was thick and humid, mixing the smell of wet earth coming in through the windows with the perfume she was still wearing, the one she had chosen so that Diego would always remember their wedding. Now the same scent made her nauseous. The phone wouldn't stop ringing. Messages, calls, social media notifications. Everyone wanted to know, some asked with morbid curiosity, others with false compassion. Lucia didn't respond. She didn't want to face everyone's judgment again. What happened in that church had already gone viral. Videos circulated showing the exact moment when Beatrice, with her venomous tone, had accused her of being pregnant by another man. Some media outlets even shared images of Diego throwing the ring and walking away without looking back. Social media was tearing her apart. An easy woman, they said. She deserves it for playing with a decent man's feelings. Lucia closed her eyes tightly, trying to block out those voices, but all she could hear were Beatrice's screams, repeating the words that had pinned her to the ground like a traitor. "You're a slut. You're expecting a child that isn't his. How could you?" Beatriz Lucia didn't understand. She had felt some nausea in recent days, but she didn't think it was important. She was stressed with the preparations. She wasn't eating well. She wasn't sleeping. She never thought she might be pregnant, much less that Diego's mother could have access to something so intimate. But the truth is that Beatrice had always had an unhealthy obsession with controlling every detail of her son's life. Lucia had noticed it from the beginning. Beatrice would come into the apartment unannounced, checking drawers, receipts, and bank statements. She said she did it to protect Diego, but in reality, she couldn't stand another woman taking her place in her son's life. A week before the wedding, Lucia had noticed that some things were missing from the bathroom, including a trash can. She never imagined that Beatrice had gone through her belongings. Even worse, she had found the wrapper of an expired pregnancy test that she had bought months earlier as a precaution. Surely the old woman had taken it, interpreted it in her own way, and used it as a weapon. But what hurt the most was not Beatrice's betrayal. It was Diego's contempt, his silence, his cowardice. He never looked her in the eye, never gave her a chance to explain. He just believed the worst. Lucia remembered all the times Diego had doubted her, the excessive jealousy, the constant questions. Who did you talk to? Who texted you? Why? Why were you late? She thought it was love, that he just wanted to take care of her. But now she understood. It was always control, mistrust, and when Beatriz gave him an excuse, he used it to get rid of her without looking back. Lucia crawled to the bathroom. The floor was cold, the mirror fogged up by the steam from the shower she never took. She left the test on the sink. She looked at it as if that could deny reality, but it was still there. 2 lines. A life inside her. She trembled and felt nauseous, but she didn't know if it was because of the pregnancy or because of fear. She curled up on the floor, hugging her legs. Tears fell silently, but she no longer screamed. She no longer had a voice. Loneliness enveloped her like a wet blanket, and no one had come to see her. Not her friends, not her mother, who lived in another state and didn't even answer the phone. Everyone had abandoned her. Everyone pointed fingers at her. Hours passed. The storm subsided. The silence was worse. Lucia, still on the floor, felt a heartbeat. She didn't know if it was her heart or something else. She put her hand on her belly. It was so early that she couldn't feel anything. But she knew there was someone there. It wasn't fair. It wasn't her fault. Not the baby's. She wasn't going to let that child be a victim of other people's hatred. She wasn't going to let Diego's contempt make her give up. She got up slowly, barefoot, her dress dragging behind her. She walked to the living room. The night was dense, but inside her something ignited, a small, fragile but real flame. "I won't leave you," she whispered, caressing her flat belly. "It doesn't matter what they say. It doesn't matter who abandoned me. It's not your fault. And I'm going to fight for you," she decided at that moment. Even if the world pointed fingers at her, even if she had to do it alone, that child would be her strength, her reason, her everything. The phone vibrated again. A message from Diego. Just one word: sorry. Lucia read it and left the phone on the table. She wouldn't open it. She didn't need to. The war was just beginning. But now, Lucia knew what she would fight for. Lucia's life was reduced to a small two-bedroom apartment with peeling walls and a persistent leak in the kitchen that marked the passage of time drop by drop, as if the rain that had accompanied her on the day of her humiliation had decided to stay with her forever. The days dragged on slowly, heavy, as if the world had lost its color. But something inside her kept beating. It wasn't just her heart. It was another rhythm, another pulse, a life growing, defying the chaos. Mornings began with nausea, dizziness, and silence. Lucia had sold her engagement ring and wedding dress to pay the rent. With that, she sometimes ate only rice and beans, and on good days, an apple. Every bite tasted like struggle, every mouthful like resistance. Her body was tired, but her mind remained awake and alert. She dreamed of that baby, although she did not know if it was a boy or a girl. The only thing she knew was that she already loved it. The streets of Guadalajara continued on their course, indifferent to her story. People looked at her with curiosity, some with pity, others with judgment. Lucia avoided going out. She feared the eyes of others, the whispers. But in the 4th month of pregnancy, her body began to change more rapidly. Her clothes no longer fit her. Her skin stretched. Her emotions became a roller coaster. And it was then that someone noticed her pain. In the apartment next door lived Doña Carmen, a 78-year-old widow with white hair and skin as wrinkled as parchment, but with eyes full of life and wisdom. Wisdom. She always wore a blue shawl, smelled of cinnamon and freshly brewed coffee, and had a habit of sitting in front of the window every afternoon with her knitting in her hands. It was she who, seeing Lucia, with her already bulging belly and sad eyes, knocked on her door one rainy afternoon. "I brought you some broth," she said, without asking permission to enter. "And don't tell me you're not hungry, because we both know you're eating very little." Lucia wanted to refuse, but she couldn't. The old woman's trembling hands, the aroma of the hot broth, the simple but genuine gesture were the first sign of sincere affection she had received since that day in the church. "Thank you," whispered Lucia, her eyes filled with tears. She had no one to tell. Everyone had turned their back on her. Doña Carmen looked at her, sat down next to her, and caressed her hand gently. "I lost a child when I was young. I could never be a mother, but you are receiving a blessing. Even if you don't understand it now, you are not alone. I am going to help you." Over the following week, Doña Carmen became her support. She taught her remedies for nausea, made her teas, and lent her loose-fitting clothes that she had once saved for her daughter-in-law. Lucia began to go out more, walking around the neighborhood, feeling the sun restore some of her energy. She began to talking to her baby. She sang to it while she cooked, read it stories at night, and caressed her belly while saying, "I will protect you, no matter what happens." In the 6th month, she bought a small stuffed animal at a thrift store. It was a brown bear with a bow around its neck. She placed it on the makeshift crib she had put together with a box and an old blanket. That night, she dreamed that her baby was smiling at her. She didn't know him, but she felt like she already knew everything about him. His movements inside her belly were gentle, sometimes abrupt, but always full of life, and with each little kick, Lucia felt stronger. However, the city was unforgiving. One day on her way to the market, she ran into an acquaintance of the Herrera family, a woman with a sharp face and a cruel look. She recognized her instantly. Look, in the end it was true. The rumor mill doesn't lie. And the father? How many will there be? Lucia lowered her gaze, swallowing her tears. But inside something hardened. Those words no longer affected her. Her baby was worth more than any contempt. That night, as the rain tapped on the windows again, Lucia felt a twinge in her stomach, first slight, then stronger. She held on to the table, breathing deeply. No, it couldn't be. It was too soon, barely 7 months. She wasn't ready. She tried to walk, but another contraction doubled her over. She screamed, but no one answered. Doña Carmen was at her daughter's house outside the city, and the phone was dead. Lucia fell to her knees, gasping for air, with water from the sink dripping incessantly. The room was spinning, her skin drenched in sweat. The baby's heartbeat continued. Keep going, my love," she whispered, as darkness enveloped her before continuing. "We want to know more about you. Where are you listening from? Leave us a comment with the name of your city or country. We would love to know how far our stories are reaching." Dawn arrived like a silent thief, enveloping the sky of Guadalajara in a black and indifferent blanket. Inside the apartment, Lucia struggled between pain and fear, covered in cold sweat, her hands clinging to the edges of a chair that moved with each contraction. Her breathing was ragged, each gasp accompanied by a muffled moan. The small space smelled of dampness, metal, slight bleeding, and desperation. With each passing second, the pain increased, as if her body were breaking from within. There was no one there. The night before, she had felt the first spasms but had ignored them. She thought it was normal, part of the process, but now she knew that her body was screaming that the moment had come, and it was too soon, only 7 months. Lucia dragged her feet to the door, her vision clouded and her lips cracked from biting them to keep from screaming. She managed to open it. Her body was screaming that the moment had come, and it was too soon, barely 7 months. Lucia dragged her feet to the door, her vision blurred, and her lips split from biting them so hard to keep from screaming. She managed to open it, and went out into the hallway. She knocked on the door of the neighbor across the hall, but no one answered. Despair consumed her. Every step was torture. She went down the stairs, leaning on the wall. It was raining again. The city seemed like an extension of her pain. She had to find a taxi. Already on the street, the puddles soaked her feet. Cars passed by, but none stopped. Lucia, distraught and trembling, doubled over from a contraction that left her breathless and screamed with the last of her strength, "Help, please!" Someone, an elderly man, saw her from a small shop that was about to close. He ran toward her, and seeing the blood running down her legs without asking any questions, called an ambulance. Minutes later, Lucia arrived at the hospital semi-conscious. They placed her on a stretcher, and the noise of voices, lights, and hands touching her incessantly confused her. She felt her legs go weak. Her legs, without asking any questions. He called an ambulance. Minutes later, Lucia arrived at the hospital semi-conscious. They placed her on a stretcher, and the noise of voices, lights, and hands touching her incessantly confused her. She felt like she was fading away. She could only think of one thing: her baby had to live. That's when Carlos Mendez appeared, a young nurse on duty, about 35 years old, with a serious face but a warm gaze. He saw her arrive, wrapped in pain, abandoned by everyone, and something inside him trembled. He took her hand, brushed the hair from her forehead, and spoke in her ear with a firm but calm voice. "Lucia, breathe. I'm with you. You're not going to be alone. We're going to save your baby. Do you hear me? Trust me." Lucia barely nodded, tears running down her cheeks. She didn't know who this man was, but in his voice, she felt something like peace. They took her to the delivery room. The sound of the monitor marked the rapid heartbeat of the baby. The doctors looked at each other with tension. It was a risky delivery, too premature, but Lucia was not going to give up. Not now, not when she had come so far. She clung to the voice of Carlos, who did not leave her side. He held her hand, wiped her forehead, and said, Be strong, Lucia. Almost there. Just a little more. Your son needs you. The minutes seemed like an eternity. Each contraction was like a blow. Lucia screamed, cried, fought. She thought she was going to die, but she couldn't. She wasn't going to leave him alone. Not him. And then a loud cry. Of course, it broke the silence like a blessing. The doctors breathed a sigh of relief. Carlos smiled for the first time. The baby cried, fragile but full of life. "It's a boy," said one of the doctors. Lucia felt the world stop. She saw him wrapped in a white blanket, small, with his eyes closed, and a cry that was music to her broken soul. Carlos brought him closer to her carefully. "Look at him. You did it, Lucia. He's fine thanks to you." She took him in her arms, trembling, and in that moment all the pain disappeared. She cradled him, kissed him on the forehead, and whispered between sobs, "Mateo, I will always take care of you." Carlos watched her from a corner, moved. He didn't know who this woman was, or what she had been through, but in her eyes he saw a strength he had rarely witnessed. Lucia spent 3 days in the hospital, slowly recovering. Mateo, although premature, was strong in the maternity ward. Amidst the cries of babies and the smell of milk and alcohol, Lucia clung to her son like a lifeline in the middle of the sea. On the 4th day, dressed in a simple gown, her hair tousled, and with Mateo asleep in her lap, someone knocked on the door. It was Carlos. He was holding a bouquet of wildflowers wrapped in craft paper and wearing a shy smile. He entered slowly, not wanting to make her uncomfortable. "I couldn't leave without seeing you. I wanted to know how you were and give you this." Lucia looked at him, surprised and speechless. It was the first time since that wedding that someone had come to offer her something without expecting anything in return. Carlos held out the flowers. "You don't have to say anything. Anything. I just wanted to tell you that you are the bravest woman I have ever met, and if you need anything, anything at all, I want to help you." Lucia looked him in the eyes with Mateo asleep on her chest, and felt that for the first time in a long time, she was not so alone. The days after Mateo's birth felt like a slow awakening. After a long nightmare, the hospital with its constant smell of disinfectant and cold lights that never went out completely had been a forced refuge, but also the setting for a new beginning. Lucia, still weak, left with her son in her arms, wrapped in uncertainty, but also with a fierce instinct she had never felt before. She didn't know how, but she knew she would protect him with her nails, teeth, and soul if necessary. Carlos Mendez accompanied her to the hospital door. It wasn't necessary. He had finished his shift hours earlier, but he waited, walking slowly beside Lucia, helping her hold the worn suitcase and discreetly glancing at the baby, who slept wrapped in blankets, his face serene, oblivious to everything his mother had suffered. "How are you going to get home?" Carlos asked, stopping on the sidewalk in front of the hospital where taxis sped by. "I'll take the bus," Lucia replied in a low voice without looking at him. Carlos frowned, not in judgment, but in genuine concern. "Lucia, please at least let me pay for the taxi. Mateo is very young. You can't get on a bus with him right now." She hesitated. She was used to rejecting help, to expecting the worst from men, but there was something about Carlos, a calmness that didn't make her afraid. She nodded slightly, and together they got into the taxi. During the ride, neither of them spoke much. Lucia looked out the window while Mateo slept on her chest, and Carlos watched her discreetly in the rearview mirror. When they arrived, he insisted on helping her carry her things, and without saying much more, he said goodbye, leaving her a small piece of paper with his number on it. "Call me if you need anything. I mean it." Lucia put it away without responding. She wouldn't call him. She didn't want to trust him. But the days passed, and reality hit her like a wall. Mateo cried at night. She barely slept. Money was scarce and her strength was beginning to wane. One night, exhausted, her breasts sore from breastfeeding, and with Mateo's inconsolable crying echoing off the walls of the apartment, she remembered the crumpled piece of paper. She didn't know why, but she dialed the number. If you were in Lucia's place right now, would you call Carlos or try to handle it alone? Tell me in the comments. Carlos answered on the second ring. He didn't ask any questions. He just listened to her broken voice and said, "I'm on my way." 20 minutes later, he knocked on the door with a bag of groceries, diapers, and a slight smile. He helped calm Matteo, prepared a bottle of milk that she had left in the refrigerator, and stayed there in silence, allowing her to rest a little, without invading or asking questions. That's how he became part of her daily life, always respectful and patient. He brought fruit, helped with the cleaning, and even repaired the leak in the kitchen without her asking. He played with Matteo and carried him with a disarming tenderness, as if the baby were something sacred. He never asked questions about Diego or the wedding or the past. He was just there, helping. Lucia, accustomed to control, to demands, to looks of superiority, felt confused and distrustful. What did he want? Why was he so kind? She forced herself to think that there was a hidden motive, but she couldn't find it. One day, while Matteo slept in his makeshift crib and the sunset bathed the room in a golden light, Carlos was preparing a meal for her in the kitchen. Lucia watched him from the doorway without him seeing her. She saw him in his everyday life, in his patience. He was a simple man, without empty promises, without demands. And then, for the first time in a long time, she felt the weight on her shoulders lighten a little. "Thank you for everything you do," she murmured as she entered the kitchen. Carlos looked at her with his warm eyes and replied, "Honestly, I do it not out of obligation. I do it because I want to. You and Matteo deserve better." She looked down nervously. "I can't offer anything, Carlos. I'm broken. I don't know if I'll ever be able to trust again." He approached her slowly, as if approaching an open wound, and held her hand. "I'm not asking anything of you. Right now, I just want to be close, if you'll let me." Weeks passed. Lucia was healthy again. She laughed again. Sometimes she slept a little longer. Carlos was still there, steadfast, without demanding, without pressuring. They became a kind of improvised family, a team. One Sunday afternoon, they were in the park with Matteo, who was already beginning to babble. Lucia was holding him in her arms, and Carlos looked at them as if that moment were all he needed in life, while the sunlight filtered through the trees and the children played in the distance. Carlos gathered his courage. "Lucia, I know life has hurt you, and I know I have no right to ask you for anything, but I want to be with you. I want you to give me the opportunity to take care of you, to take care of Matteo as if he were my own son. I can be part of their lives." Lucia looked at him, unable to speak, her heart feeling strong. As if revealing himself, Matteo laughed in her arms, innocent, and the wind blew softly, as if pushing her to decide. She took a deep breath, not knowing if she was ready, but for the first time, she felt that she wasn't doomed to be alone. Lucia never thought she would love again, not after the humiliation she had experienced, not after being discarded, as if she were worthless in front of hundreds of people she once considered friends and family. But life, with its strange way of healing, brought Carlos into her path, and little by little, without her realizing it, the days stopped being so heavy, the nights less long, and the wounds, well, they didn't disappear, but they stopped bleeding. They began their relationship cautiously, like someone walking on broken glass. Carlos was patient, never pressuring her, taking her hand without squeezing it, looking at her as if she were fragile but also strong, as if he knew that inside her there was a war going on. He accompanied her everywhere, and with Matteo it was different from anything she had ever seen. He cared for him as if he were truly his son, without hesitation. He played with him, bathed him, told him stories before bed, and sometimes when they thought Lucia wasn't watching, Carlos would kiss him on the forehead and say, "You're the best thing that ever happened to me." Matteo grew up with that love. He wanted for nothing, but what he had most was affection, time, and presence. At 2 years old, he was already calling Carlos Dad naturally, and Lucia allowed it, not out of obligation or convenience, but because she knew that this man had filled every void that Diego had left, and more. Carlos never raised his voice, never doubted her, never made her feel inferior. There were moments when Lucia remembered Diego's looks of contempt, Beatrice's poisonous words, the nights she spent crying inconsolably. Sometimes those memories made her tremble, but then she would look at Carlos cooking in the small kitchen of their new apartment, while Mateo stirred everything around him, and she understood that she had survived, and that real love didn't hurt, didn't humiliate, didn't demand. Real love healed. If this moment gave you hope, tap like so more people discover this story. One day, as they strolled through the historic center amid the bustle of people and the sound of mariachis playing in the distance, Carlos knelt down and took out a small, simple velvet box with a ring that reflected the sunlight. "Lucia, I don't want to spend another day without calling you my wife. I want to continue building a life with you. I can't promise you a life without problems, but I can promise you a life with you. Will you marry me?" she cried, not out of sadness, but out of the certainty that this time she was not alone at the altar. She accepted between tears and laughter while Mateo hugged them, not fully understanding, but happy for his mother's excitement. They were married in an intimate ceremony with only real friends, without luxuries, but with something Lucia had never had before: peace. Carlos's family. Carlos's family welcomed her with open arms, and for the first time, someone called her daughter. With sincerity, they bought a small house on the outskirts of Guadalajara with a garden, swings for Mateo, and space for dreams. Lucia returned to teaching at a local school, something she loved. Carlos prospered in his nursing career, but without losing their simplicity, every day when he came home, Mateo would run to hug him as if he hadn't seen him in years. 6 years passed. Love true story dramas with real twists? Subscribe and turn on notifications for the next chapter. Mateo was a bright, curious child, with a broad smile and eyes like Lucia's. He had boundless energy, asked about everything, touched everything, and his laughter filled the house. His room was full of drawings, toys, and stuffed animals. He was happy, but life is capricious and does not allow happiness to last without trials. One night, after playing all day, Mateo complained of a headache. Lucia thought he was tired, gave him a bath, put him to bed early, but in the middle of the night, she heard him crying. He had a high fever. Carlos went to get the thermometer. It read 40 degrees. They gave him medicine, but the fever didn't go down. Mateo began to shake. His lips turned purple, his eyes lost. "Carlos, he's not responding! He's not responding!" Lucia shouted with the child in her arms as tears fell like rain. Carlos grabbed the keys, wrapped him in a blanket, and in minutes, they were on their way to the hospital. Mateo, the child for whom Lucia had survived, was between life and death, and she was once again heartbroken. The cold lights of the hospital glowed in Lucia's glassy eyes as she clung to Mateo's lifeless hand. He was lying on a children's stretcher, with white sheets that contrasted with the paleness of his skin. The monitors kept beeping constantly, marking the irregular rhythm of his heart, and the oxygen escaped with a subtle buzz from the tube that helped him breathe. Every second was torture. Carlos paced back and forth, desperate, his face tense and his eyes red. The doctors still didn't know what Mateo had: a severe viral infection, possibly meningitis, but the tests were still being carried out. Lucia couldn't take it anymore. The fear that oppressed her chest was worse than anything she had ever felt before. She had faced the world alone. She had rebuilt her life with her own hands. But now her son was there, struggling to breathe, and she couldn't do anything. The hours passed slowly. A nurse came in to say that they had to transfer him to another area to perform a CT scan. Carlos accompanied her. Lucia was left alone in the waiting room, sitting on a cold bench, hugging herself. It was then that the automatic door opened and Diego Herrera, walking slowly, his face marked by time, deep dark circles under his eyes, and an empty, bluish gaze. He was being pushed in a wheelchair by a nurse. Beatriz was unrecognizable. Her hair was no longer shiny black, but thin and gray, her skin ashen, her eyes sunken. Lucia felt a chill run down her spine. The past had returned. She jumped up. It couldn't be a coincidence. The two of them there, on that very day, at that very moment. The same people who had condemned, humiliated, and abandoned, were standing in front of her. Diego saw her and stopped as if he had seen a ghost. Lucia whispered with a broken voice. Beatrice looked up and recognized her. Her expression was not one of contempt. This time it was one of guilt, fear, and defeat. "What are you doing here?" Lucia asked, her heart beating wildly. Diego took a hesitant step forward. "My mother is terminally ill. She came to receive palliative care. I came to accompany her." Lucia clenched her fists. She felt her soul burning. So many nights crying because of them. Now, just when Matteo needed stability the most, the past appeared like a shadow. "You have no business here. Get out." Diego moved closer, his eyes glassy. Then, from the end of the hallway, Carlos appeared with Matteo in his arms, covered with a blue blanket. He looked at him and ran towards them. Diego also looked at him and froze. Matteo's face, even sick, was a mirror of his own face when he was a child. The same eyes, the same nose, the same expression. "Is it him?" Diego asked breathlessly. "He's my son." Lucia turned slowly, hugging Matteo to her chest. "It's Matteo. And yes, he's your biological son, but you lost him 6 years ago." Diego couldn't find the words. His gaze became empty, and then Beatrice spoke. Her voice was barely a whisper, but laden with remorse. "Lucia, I'm sorry. I made it up. That lie. I followed you. I went through your trash. I made up the story. I wanted to destroy you, and I succeeded." Lucia stood motionless. She couldn't even cry. Carlos stood behind her, listening to everything in silence, his jaw tense. Diego fell to his knees. "I didn't know. I trusted her. I swear I thought you had betrayed me." Lucia looked at him with a mixture of compassion and anger. "I don't care what you thought. Matteo already has a father, a real one who has been there every day of his life, who loves him as you could never love anyone." Diego raised his head and looked at Carlos. Lucia took a deep breath, her eyes fixed on Diego's. "Carlos is the only father Matteo knows, and he is the only one who deserves that title. You are just a man from the past. Nothing more." Diego collapsed with his hands over his face. Lucia turned, hugging Matteo, and left, leaving Diego and Beatrice facing their own ruin. The days that followed were filled with tension, fear, and exhaustion. Matteo, still hospitalized, fought the infection like a silent warrior surrounded by machines, needles, and hurried doctors. Lucia never left his side, sleeping on an uncomfortable chair with her clothes, her hair tied back hastily, and her eyes swollen from crying so much. Carlos was also always there, tirelessly holding her hand and facing everything with her, just as he had promised. On the third morning of hospitalization, the fever began to subside. Matteo's body, which had been burning up, began to calm down, and the doctors spoke of improvement. Lucia cried with relief for the first time in days, hugging her son tightly, feeling that the worst was perhaps behind them, but the peace was short-lived. That afternoon, as she was placing a wet compress on Matteo's forehead, a nurse approached her. "Mrs. Lucia, there's someone who wants to see you. They're in the waiting room and say it's important." Lucia frowned. She knew who it was before even asking. She thanked the nurse silently, kissed Matteo's forehead, and with a heavy heart, left the room. When she opened the door to the waiting room, there was Diego, standing with his head down, like a defeated man. He no longer had the proud look he had before, nor the posture of someone who thought he was better than everyone else. He was just an empty man. Lucia stopped at the entrance in silence. Diego raised his face, and his eyes were red, not only from crying, but also from shame. "I need to talk to you. Talk from there." Diego took a deep breath, swallowing hard. "I want to see him. See Matteo just once." Lucia closed her eyes. For a moment, her first instinct was to say no. He didn't deserve it. But Matteo deserved to know the truth, and she was no longer afraid of Diego. "He still doesn't know who you are," said Lucia coldly. "You're going to go in. You're going to see him, but you're not going to say anything that might confuse him. One false move, and you're never coming near him again. Do you understand?" Diego nodded. Minutes later, they entered the room together. Matteo was asleep, his hair stuck to his sweaty forehead. his cheeks pale. Diego approached slowly, as if the floor were about to give way beneath his feet. He looked at the boy for several long seconds, his eyes filled with tears. He looks so much like me. Lucia didn't respond. Carlos was standing on the other side of the bed, staring at Diego. A tense atmosphere filled the room, but Mateo, as if sensing something, slowly opened his eyes. "Mommy," he said in a weak voice. Lucia smiled with relief and took his hand. Diego hesitantly approached. "Hello, Mateo," he said in a trembling voice. "I'm a friend of your mom's." Mateo looked at him curiously. "Friend?" Diego nodded, kneeling next to the bed. "Your smile is just like mine when I was a child." He smiled with tears running down his face. Mateo frowned, intrigued. "Do you know my grandmother?" he asked suddenly. Diego was speechless. Lucia tensed. Carlos pressed his lips together. "Yes," Diego replied, swallowing hard. "I know her. I can see her," said Mateo innocently, unaware of wounds or lies. "They say she's sick." Lucia felt her heart skip a beat. Diego looked at her for permission, like a man without strength. Hours later, Mateo was allowed to leave the pediatric ward for a few minutes, as long as he was in a wheelchair. Lucia agreed. Something inside her told her that this encounter had to happen. Beatrice was in the same hospital in palliative care, the end approaching. They arrived at the room where Beatrice was. The atmosphere was silent, the smell of medicine strong, the light dim. Beatrice was lying pale as the wall behind her, breathing with difficulty. When she saw Lucia enter with Mateo in her arms, the woman's eyes opened like never before. Mateo whispered, trying to sit up. Mateo looked at her curiously. "You're my grandmother." Beatrice tried to speak, but her voice failed her. Tears rolled down her cheeks, heavy, as if they carried the weight of years of resentment. "Yes, and forgive me, Mateo. Forgive me." The boy approached her and placed his little hand on hers. "It's okay. I forgive you." Beatrice broke down and cried like never before in her life. Regret consumed her. Sobs shook her fragile body. Lucia watched everything from afar, her chest tight, not knowing what to feel. When Mateo was taken back, Beatrice called her in a faint voice. "Lucia, come here." She hesitated, then approached. Beatrice looked at her with tired eyes, without a trace of arrogance. "I destroyed you. I lied. I took everything from you out of pride. I hate myself, so forgive me for what I did to you, for what I took from you." Lucia closed her eyes. The past weighed heavily on her. The scars hurt. And in that room, with the sound of the heart monitor marking the end, the past and the present collided. She took a deep breath without responding. Beatrice died in silence just a few minutes after uttering those last words. Her breathing became heavier, more ragged, as if each breath were a lament carried by the years of hatred and lies she had cultivated. Diego was there by her side, holding her cold hand, powerless, watching the life of the woman who had controlled him since childhood slowly slip away. The monitor marked the end with a long, sharp beep that broke the air like a muffled scream. It was all over. Lucia watched from the doorway with her arms crossed, her face impassive, but inside, she felt a whirlwind of emotions that were difficult to name. It was not joy nor relief. It was a weight dissolving, like a knot slowly loosening. Beatrice, the woman who had destroyed his world with poisonous words and cruel lies, was now leaving without seeing Mateo grow up, without being able to change what she had done. Diego let go of his mother's hand and backed away, sitting down on a chair next to the bed, his face covered in tears, his eyes red. But he wasn't crying, Leo, for Beatrice's death. He was crying for the loss of everything, for the life he had ruined. In his mind, the images returned like ghosts. He was walking toward the altar, his gaze radiant and full of hope. Beatrice interrupted everything, shouting those words. He threw the ring on the floor without hesitation, without listening to her, without giving her the benefit of the doubt, leaving as if she meant nothing. That tormented him, now more than ever, because in that moment with his mother's cold hand still in his memory, Diego understood what he had really lost. Lucia left silently without looking back. Carlos had already returned to the room with Mateo, who was sleeping peacefully, oblivious to everything. Diego sat there staring at his mother's lifeless body, with the monitor already turned off. The room was pure silence. In the hallway, the walls seemed to close in on him. The remorse was unbearable, weighing heavily on him on his chest like a slab he couldn't remove. Diego walked aimlessly through the hospital corridors. Memories mingled with the sounds of the past. Lucia's crying at the altar, the applause that turned into murmurs, the reproachful looks, and now, Mateo's fragile face in bed, so similar to his own. He couldn't go on like this. He had to do something, even if it was too late. Hours later, as night fell over Guadalajara, the sky and the smell of rain in the air, Diego went to the room where Mateo was. Lucia was reading a book aloud to her son, who already seemed to be regaining color in his face. Carlos was sitting next to him, drawing something in a notebook. Diego stood at the door, nervous, not knowing if he had the right to enter. He knocked twice with trembling knuckles. Lucia looked up and saw him. Carlos did too. Mateo didn't notice. "What do you want?" Lucia asked, unable to hide the exhaustion and coldness in her voice. Diego took a deep breath. "I need to talk to him. Just for a moment. I want him to get to know me. I won't tell him anything you shouldn't know." Carlos stood up, his gaze hard, but it was Lucia who spoke. "We don't need you anymore, Diego. Sooner or later, Mateo will know the whole truth, but he doesn't owe you anything. You abandoned him before he even knew you." Diego took a step forward. "I know. I'm not here to ask for anything, just to see if there's a chance. Just one." Lucia looked at Mateo, who was sleeping peacefully. Her heart tightened. She had built everything with effort, alone. Carlos had been a father, a friend, love. Diego was just a bitter memory. She looked at him again. "You have 5 minutes." Diego approached the bed slowly, knelt down beside it, and looked at his son with eyes full of tears. He stroked the child's soft hair and whispered softly, "I'm your father, but I don't deserve you. I wasted every second I should have spent with you, and I regret it more than you can imagine." Mateo slowly opened his eyes, confused, and saw Diego there. "Who are you?" he asked in a hoarse voice. Diego hesitated and looked at Lucia, who was watching him silently. "I'm someone who wants to see you. Can I come visit you sometime?" Mateo yawned, still not understanding. "Did you bring candy?" Diego smiled, crying, "I'll bring you all you want." Lucia watched everything with a tight chest. The past was knocking at her door, and she still didn't know if she should let it in. The following days were a whirlwind of contained emotions, heavy silences, and looks that said more than any words. Mateo was discharged from the hospital and returned home with Lucia and Carlos, but something had changed. Not in the child, who returned to playing, laughing, and running around the house as usual, but in the air around them, in Lucia's eyes that avoided Carlos's, and in the forced smile he used to hide what he really felt. Diego had asked to visit Mateo, arguing that he didn't want to take anything away, just to be present and make up for the lost years. Lucia didn't know what to think. Mateo, on the other hand, was excited when he showed up. Diego brought toys and candy and told stories from when he was a child, stories that Mateo listened to with fascination, with eyes shining with curiosity. With each visit, the boy asked more questions. He wanted to know more. "Why didn't you ever come to see me before?" Mateo asked one afternoon while playing with a toy car Diego had given him. Diego froze. He didn't know how to respond. "I was far away because I was foolish," he muttered, glancing sideways at Lucia. "But now I want to be close." Lucia watched from afar, her heart torn. Carlos sat on the sofa, watching everything in silence, but his hands were clenched into fists. He was a calm man, but it was impossible not to feel that his space, his family, was being invaded by someone who had only now decided to show up. That night, after Diego left, the atmosphere in the house was tense. Carlos tried to pretend everything was normal, but he couldn't. Lucia was making dinner, and they both avoided looking at each other. "We need to talk," he finally said, crossing his arms. "I can't take this anymore." Lucia stopped what she was doing and took a deep breath. She already knew this conversation was coming. I'm not defending Diego, she said firmly. But Mateo wants to see him, and I can't forbid him. And what am I? Carlos asked, his voice louder than normal. A spectator? The one who was with you when everyone else left you. And now I have to stand by and watch him come in and win over the child with gifts? Lucia felt the blow. It wasn't just jealousy. It was fear. Fear of losing the place she had worked so hard to earn. Mateo calls you Dad, she said softly. He always has. But I can't control what he feels. He's innocent. And you know he loves you. Carlos lowered his head, his hands trembling. I know, but I don't want to lose him. I don't want to lose you. Lucia approached him and put her hand on his face. You're not going to lose me. But she herself wasn't sure about that. The weeks passed. Diego continued to show up with controlled visits, always bringing gifts. Mateo wanted him, but he didn't call him Dad. That title belonged to Carlos. And when the three of them were together, Lucia, Carlos, and Mateo, the house was still full of love. But Diego's shadow lingered, subtle like a past that wouldn't go away. One Saturday afternoon, Mateo was playing in the garden while Lucia watched him from the window. Carlos approached quietly. I can't live like this, he said sadly. I can't be second best. I can't pretend it doesn't hurt. He felt awe in his stomach. Carlos, you're not second best. You're the only one who was there, the only one who picked me up when I had nothing. But Mateo has the right to decide. He has the right to know who Diego is. I have to allow it, for his sake. Carlos walked away, dejected. That night, Lucia stayed awake, sitting next to Mateo's bed, listening to his peaceful breathing. She thought about everything, about what was right, about what was fair, about what she wanted, and what Mateo needed. At dawn, with the sun streaming into the house, she made the decision, one that would change everything, one that would have consequences. She was ready to face whatever came. The years passed in a flash, and Guadalajara continued on its course, indifferent to the drama that had once enveloped Lucia's life. In the little house where there had been so much crying, now there was laughter. Mateo's genuine laughter as he ran around the yard with a paper airplane in his hands, shouting as if he could fly with it. Lucia watched him from the terrace with a serene smile, her gaze full of peace. Carlos prepared roast beef on the small grill, wiping his hands on his apron as he looked at his son with that proud gleam in his eyes. The pain was no longer a constant presence. It had become a scar, and scars, although they do not disappear, teach us to value calm. After the storm, Mateo was now 8 years old, intelligent, sensitive, curious. He continued to call Carlos Dad without hesitation, without questions. But sometimes at night, when silence invaded the house and doubts came without warning, he would bring up the subject. Mom, can I ask you something? Lucia already knew what was coming. It always came. Of course, my love. Mateo sat on the bed with his big attentive eyes. That man, Diego. Why doesn't he come anymore? Lucia sat down his side, stroking his hair. He had to go away for a while. He had to sort things out in his life. Important things. Mateo frowned. But he was my dad. Lucia felt her heart tighten, but she didn't look away. He's a person who loved your mom very much. A long time ago. And you came along later, like a gift. But Carlos was the one who was always there for you, who has loved you since you were little. You know that, right, Mateo? He nodded, although he didn't seem entirely convinced. So Diego doesn't love me anymore. Lucia hugged him tightly, silent tears in her eyes. It's not that, Mateo. Sometimes people make the wrong decisions, and then when they want to fix them, it's too late. But you don't have to worry about that. When you're older, you'll understand better, and you'll decide what you want to do with all that. Mateo was silent for a moment, then smiled slightly. Okay, but I already have the best dad. Lucia laughed with relief and kissed his forehead. On the other side of the city, Diego Herrera walked alone through a park, the same one where years ago Lucia had said yes to Carlos. Sometimes he saw them from afar. Mateo was growing up fast, healthy, and happy. Diego didn't approach them. He didn't have the courage. He didn't have the right. The memory of the altar, Beatrice's words, his own cowardice consumed him day after day. He had believed in the perfect lie. a lie that gave him the momentary comfort of escaping from a truth he didn't want to hear. And that decision cost him his whole life. He paid dearly for believing in the perfect lie and abandoning true love. Sometimes the truth comes, but it comes too late.